Good afternoon, everybody. We're just waiting for everybody to join us. So just give us a minute and we'll start soon. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our event, Nature's Role in the Economy, an Introduction to Natural Capital. My name is Zara from WWF Malaysia, and I will be your MC for today. This session is a collaboration between Capital Markets Malaysia, WWF Malaysia, the British High Commission in Kuala Lumpur, and the British Malaysian Chamber of Commerce. All of our organizations have gotten together to introduce the concept of natural capital to you today, because we strongly believe that businesses both impact and depend on natural capital, and that you will benefit from knowing how. Additionally, globally, we are seeing a big move to reporting on natural capital, just as we saw with climate change. This introductory session is the first of 4 sessions that Capital Markets Malaysia and WWF Malaysia will bring to you on natural capital throughout 2022. The other 3 will focus on assessing, reporting, and using the results of your assessments to inform your business strategy. Today, for this session, we are pleased to bring you Isabel Hoffman from the Capitals Coalition and Michael Salvatico from S&P Global Sustainable One to speak to you. Before that, we will have introductions from His Excellency Charles Hay, the British High Commissioner to Malaysia, and Sophia Lim, the Executive Director and CEO of WWF Malaysia. We will finish with a Q&A session with our speakers, Isabel and Michael, with Zalina Shamsuddin of Capital Markets Malaysia as our moderator. The webinar will last for 1 hour, although we have gotten kind consent from the speakers and organizers to extend to 1 hour and 15 minutes if required. If you have any questions, please do enter them into our Q&A box on the bottom of the screen. Okay, let us start the session. Firstly, let us hear from His Excellency, the British High Commissioner to Malaysia, Charles Hay.
Welcome to today's webinar. I would have wished to wish you all a happy new year, but for many Malaysians, given the floods here, it hasn't been a particularly happy start to the new year. As many have recognised, the damage caused by these floods is a tragic and costly reminder of failing to care for our common home, of failing to value nature in our planning and our economic decisions, and of taking nature for granted. But I believe this is beginning to change. There's a growing momentum behind the realization that nature is the foundation of our human well-being and our economic prosperity. To take one relevant example, floodplains and mangroves provide natural defences against flood risks from extreme rainfall and storm surges. And like any other form of infrastructure, they need to be maintained and cared for. At last November's climate change conference in Glasgow, nature was prominent in a way that it's never been before at UN climate discussions. We saw the Glasgow's Leaders' Declaration, bringing together 140 leaders, representing 90% of the world's forests, and pledging to halt and reverse forest loss and land degradation by 2030. We saw the endorsement of the Forest, Agriculture and Commodity Trade Dialogue Roadmap, and that charts a course for sustainable commodity production and consumption. We were delighted that Malaysia was part of both of these initiatives. Malaysia, of course, has a special role to play, being home to some of the world's most diverse tropical rainforests. But making these initiatives real involves businesses just as much as governments, because businesses, of course, are what drive economic development. And as Cambridge economics professor Sir Partha Dasgupta has said, truly sustainable economic growth and development means recognizing that our long-term prosperity relies on rebalancing our demand of nature's goods with its capacity to supply them. Last year, the UK Treasury published the Dasgupta Review on the economics of biodiversity, which I would commend to all of you. Its basic point is that we need to account fully for the impact of our interactions with nature across all levels of the economy. Nature has to be a part of the way that we calculate profit, loss, and our subject today, capital. Like other forms of capital, natural capital needs to be safeguarded and invested in to thrive. Why we need to incorporate nature and the value of nature into our economic decision-making, I hope, is evident. But how do we go about doing that? Answering this question is why the British High Commission, in partnership with WWF and Capital Markets Malaysia, is pleased to co-host today's webinar on natural capital. And I hope that you'll come away from today inspired by the examples and the lessons shared by our panelists on how companies around the world are incorporating natural capital into their business models and plans. This is a sector still in its infancy, especially here in Malaysia. But there are early mover advantages for those that innovate and lead. Businesses that lead will thrive on the opportunities that a transition to carbon neutrality provides. Nature can and must be a part of this. Too.
Thank you, High Commissioner, for next. Let's go to the Executive Director and CEO of WWF Malaysia, Ms. Sophia Lim.
Welcome to today's webinar.
A very good afternoon to everyone here today. I am pleased and excited to welcome you for the first of a series of events which WWF Malaysia will be organizing with Capital Markets Malaysia, or CMM, on natural capital in 2022. My gratitude goes to the High Commissioner, His Excellency Charles Hay, for taking the time to record a message for our event today, and also to his team at the British High Commission in Kuala Lumpur, as well as the British Malaysian Chamber of Commerce for their support. We are proud to be working with Capital Markets Malaysia, or CMM, as one of their knowledge partners at the Centre for Sustainable Corporations to bring you this exciting series which aim to build more in-depth knowledge on natural capital for businesses in Malaysia. As many of you know, our mission at WWF is to protect nature. Our work originates not just from a deep respect and appreciation for nature, but also because we recognize that nature is the foundation of all that we have. We all know that we depend on the natural environment to provide our basic needs for survival. What we may not realize, however, is businesses' dependence on nature. Last year, WWF Malaysia, Capital Markets Malaysia, and the British High Commission screened a firm called Our Planet, Our Business at IGEM, the International Green Tech and Eco Products Exhibition and Conference Malaysia. In it, we saw how businesses could impact nature, but also how the degradation of nature could devastate businesses. With the concept of natural capital, we recognize that nature is a capital, a form of wealth. It provides inputs into many businesses, and when it is threatened, so too are businesses. It therefore only makes good business sense to recognize and account for natural capital and to formally recognize the risks and opportunities for businesses which arise from nature. Where our dependencies are great, we should also measure our use of natural capital, because we can't manage what we don't measure, and what we don't manage can quickly overwhelm a business. With that in mind, following this introductory session, WWF Malaysia and CMM aim to run 3 more sessions on natural capital throughout 2022. We have identified and started reaching out to experts to talk to you about assessing and reporting natural capital and identifying risks and opportunities for your business. We are excited for these sessions and sincerely hope that you will find them useful. Let me just wrap up by saying thank you, terima kasih, to our wonderful speakers for this session, Isabel Hoffman and Michael Salvatico, for making themselves available for us. I'm very glad that you accepted our invitation to speak to our audience and to share with us your work at the Capitals Coalition and S&P Global Sustainable One. Thank you again, and I hope that you have a fruitful session. And as we say in WWF Malaysia, together possible.
Thank you, Sophia. Now let me introduce our first expert speaker, Isabel Hoffman of the Capitals Coalition, who is joining us today from London. Isabel is a manager on the TEEP Agri-Food Business Implementation Project, which works to integrate the value of natural, social, and human capital into decision-making along the agri-value chain. She's the co-author of the TEEP Agri-Food Operational Guidelines for Business and works on content development for a number of other projects, including upscaling the capital's approach for the oceans. She is also an active board member of the Tour de Valat Wetland Research Institute and of the Scientific and Technical Committee of the Prince Albert II of Monaco Foundation. Please take it away, Isabel.
Great, thank you very much for that introduction, and it's great to be here with all of you today. So without further ado, I'm going to talk to you about natural capital. And let's start why we're all here. We all know that we are failing to address the global challenges of nature loss, climate change, and rising inequality. And this really is because our economic system is failing to recognize our own dependence on nature, on people, and on society in general. And we really need to start taking that into account and taking into account how we interact with nature and people if we're going to ever hope to solve these problems. So our shared ambition at the Capitals Coalition is that by 2030, the majority of business, finance, and government include the value of nature and the value of people in their decision-making. We all impact and depend on nature, that much is clear, but whether or not we're directly aware of it is another question. And as long as nature is not visible in our decisions, we're going to continue to keep mismanaging it. And that is a significant risk to business. But if we do understand it, it can really present quite a lot of opportunity. And that's what we're going to learn a bit about how that works today. And it's what the organization that I work for, the Capitals Coalition, it's what we're trying to achieve in general. And just a couple of words on who we are. We're a global collaboration that's redefining value to transform decision-making. And in essence, what we do is we bring together a number of different organizations, I think it's 400 at the last count, who are all working in this space, and we run different projects, we foster collaboration, we develop different guidelines, and we are promoting training as well. So we've been around since 2015, when we first published the Natural Capital Protocol, which you may have heard of if you're in this space. And since then, we've also evolved to consider the different capitals, which we'll come to in a moment. But what we've really noticed since 2015 is this acceleration in the uptake of these concepts. So before 2020, value accounting, or the capitals approach, was really something that businesses did because they could do it. And mostly it was done as an interesting exercise, apart from a few forward-thinking businesses. But what we're currently seeing is this acceleration of the curve, where more and more businesses are seeing that, yes, we should actually be considering more than just our financial capital. And we're in fact approaching this new normal where all decisions are based on the value of all of the different capitals. So what exactly do we mean by these capitals and using them to make our decisions? Before we get any deeper, let's just make sure we're all on the same page about what we mean by the capitals. So capital in traditional terms has always been thought of as money, but actually capital is anything that provides value to people. So what we're concerned with today is natural capital, and the definition of that is the stock of renewable and non-renewable natural resources that combine to yield a flow of benefits to people. So that's trees, rivers, pollinators, and much more. But then we also have this human and social capital, and that's all about people, individuals, society, and how they bring value to business and to people. And then there's one that we all know, which is produced capital, and that's what people make. So buildings, infrastructure, financial assets. Now, all of these different capitals are important, but I really want to stress that natural capital does underpin all of the other capitals, because without nature, none of the other capitals exist. So we're going to focus just on natural capital today. And what this capitals approach is all about is getting better information to make more complete, better decisions. Adopting a capitals approach gives organizations the ability to understand how their success is underpinned by natural capital. And that really can empower them to make decisions that offer the greatest value across all the capitals. So the greatest value for nature and for people, for their own business and for society in general. The success of organizations all the way around the world is dependent on the capitals, but they don't often know this. And the capitals approach makes these visible and therefore makes them valued. So it's basically just a way of making decisions beyond just looking at money. And it differs from traditional decision-making in three main ways. So firstly, we're looking at dependencies on nature as well as just impacts. And that really gives the case for looking after your capital because you know that you really need it. Secondly, the capitals approach goes beyond just measurement to also include valuation, where the context of an impact and a dependency is also taken into account. And we'll talk about this more in a minute. And finally, the approach also allows you to consider a whole system or a whole value chain at the same time, rather than different impacts in isolation. But to understand how the capitals approach work, we have to look at how capitals bring value to people. So all capitals exist as a stock, and these stocks combine to yield a flow of benefits that are very valuable to society and to business. So for example, for natural capital, the stock could be forest. The forest yields a flow of ecosystem services like clean air, and that has a value to people because they don't get ill, because they've got clean air to breathe. And all of that came from the stock of natural capital, the functioning flow, and then it creates benefits for people. But how does that really relate to business? So a business depends on the capital stocks and flows to support. So for example, natural capital provides the essentials for business like land, raw material, energy. But business does also impact on natural capital, and they can degrade, deplete, maybe they can restore or regenerate natural capital as well. It doesn't all have to be negative. And that's going to impact the whole system. So these impacts and these dependencies, they translate into costs and benefits for the business and for society. And understanding this relationship with the capitals and the effect of changing the stock of capitals can show businesses the different risks and opportunities that exist around them, and then how they can make the most of them and how they can better manage them. And of course, the same applies for the financial sector, because everything that happens in the system feeds back to the financial institutions. So let's look at this example. Let's say that a business has an impact through their water use. That leads to a cost for society, which is as the reduced availability of water in the region. And then understanding that cost, we see that actually that's a risk for the business because they're not going to be able to operate if they have no water. So the same is true for dependencies. For example, if a business depends on raw material in their manufacturing, they might decide to invest in research and development for an alternative material. This is going to benefit the business in the long run because they're going to improve their resilience to shortages and their reputation as a company that doesn't use non-renewable resources. So by identifying that dependency, they're able to make the most of an operational opportunity. So now that we know that each of us impacts and depends on natural capital, and that this can result in risks and opportunities for your business and for society around you, let's look at how you actually manage that. So here, let's look at this impact pathway, which is how you would go about valuing your impacts. But I'll keep it simple as we don't have very much time. So here is a business that manufactures chemicals, and that produces air emissions. This leads to a change in natural capital, which is reduced air quality. Both the impact driver and the change in natural capital can be measured using different types of data, and lots of good businesses already do this. But the change in natural capital really causes consequences on humans as well. And in this case, they have awful health problems from bad air. And this impact has a value because it is felt by people. This valuation element is really what sets the capital approach apart, because you're not only looking at absolute numbers floating around, you're actually understanding these numbers within their context. So it's not a company uses 10,000 litres of water, it's a company contributes to water scarcity by X amount, resulting in X number of human costs in the region. So it's much more interesting and relevant information than just an impact measurement. So just checking on my time. So let's look at what that means in practice. What do you do with this valuation once you've got it? Isn't this just one more thing that you have to think about? Well, actually, the information that you get from a natural capital assessment can be really interesting to integrate in your current sustainability ambitions. So a lot of companies are already doing this, and we have a big database on our website that I'll share later that gives lots of examples. But I'm going to just show you the example of Kering, who used a natural capital assessment to help them with their reporting and with their disclosure. So if you're not familiar with Kering, they are a luxury goods brand. They own brands like Gucci and Puma, amongst others. And they did this natural capital assessment in the form of an environmental profit and loss account. So in order to inform the environmental profit and loss account, which is basically a way of gathering data in a similar format to a financial profit and loss account. So it's easily comparable. So basically what Kering do is year on year, they compare data on each of the capitals and look at their impacts along the whole value chain. So let's look a bit more carefully at how this works. So let's look at this figure here. And what it does is it shows the 5 tiers of Kering's value chain. So the warehouses, their stores, their offices, assembly, manufacturing, raw material processing, and raw material production. It also shows the different impacts that they have. So air emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, land use, waste, water consumption, water pollution. So they value this impact in monetary terms all along the value chain. So this information is really interesting in reporting and internal decision making because it shows you the disaggregated values of each different element. So it provides you this overview of what their impacts are, but it also shows you a focused image of where the problem is. So they've really got these zones that they can work on. So let's look at the land use row, this green one here. The impact is huge at the raw material production stage, but very minor along the rest of the value chain. And despite this, it's the second most impactful area, which accounts for 32% of their whole environmental impacts. So this clearly gives Kering information on where they need to act and at which stage of the value chain they need to act. And it's a really useful communication tool because we can look at this and see immediately where they're working, where they need to do their work and where they don't need to. And it really helps to make clearer decisions. So just in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over that. But as I say, there are lots of examples on our website, which you can have a look at afterwards. But this process of getting to where Kering has got is quite complicated. There are lots of different stages, and that's why we need the Natural Capital Protocol. And this is a decision-making framework that really enables organizations to identify, measure, and value their direct and their indirect impacts and dependencies on natural capital. So it's broken down into 4 stages, 9 steps, different questions, very clear to answer, which helps you get to the end of an assessment. And it's applicable with any business, any organization of any size in any geography. So it's a very, very standardized approach to this. And I'll share as well a link in the chat. Now, there are lots of other frameworks that we've developed, and in particular, I want to draw attention to the TEEB Agri-Food Operational Guidelines for Business, which bring together all of the different capitals in this same format. And the reason that I want to talk about this is because we are actually running training program in Malaysia starting in March. We're really seeing a growing interest in this work in Malaysia. And this is an opportunity for businesses anywhere along the agri-value chain to learn a little bit more about how to apply this methodology. And when I say the agri-value chain, that includes banks, transport, production, input companies. It's really very broad reaching. And the dates are on the screen, and I will post a link to the chat very shortly. So I think that that's probably my time up, but just a concluding point on what we've just spoken about. A natural capital approach is a way of making better decisions. And it's a lens that you can apply to everything that you already do. And it just brings you more information beyond just financial capital to create more complete decisions. It's not a new approach. You're probably already doing a lot of similar things, but it's about organizing that information in a way that really brings to value what nature is doing for us and for your business. So thank you. I will pass over now for questions.
Thanks very much, Isabel. I think we're going to go to Michael right now, and we'll keep the questions for the end for the Q&A. So let me introduce our next speaker, Michael Savatico. Michael leads Environmental, Social, and Governance, otherwise known as ESG, Business Development in Asia Pacific for S&P Global Sustainable One, and he joins us from Sydney, where he is based. Michael has been providing sustainable solutions to investors, banks, corporates, regulators, governments, and academics for over a decade. He works with these organizations to understand and better benchmark, report, engage, analyze, and model ESG risks and opportunities across their organizations. Over this time, a key focus has been climate change impacts on global economies, corporates, and financial institutions, with deep experience in de-risking portfolios, identifying opportunities, and reporting on baseline footprinting and scenario analysis. Michael regularly presents at events and has been and continues to be involved in ESG initiatives, including ASFI Technical Working Group, Enhancing Sustainability, Resilience, and Stability of the Financial System, PRI Fixed Income Working Group, Willoughby Council Sustainability Reference Group, IGCC Policy Advocacy Working Group, AIGCC Physical Risks and Resilience Working Group, and HKGFA ESG Disclosure and Integration Working Group. A lot of work that he's been putting into ESG. Thank you, Michael, and over to you.
Unmute. There you go. Thank you very much, Zara. What a wonderful introduction. I appreciate that. And hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Isabel, for the leading presentation into this. It's a pleasure to be here and to discuss with you natural capital. I'm going to jump straight into the presentation and starting with a slide that is very meaningful to me. It represents why we're all here, and I think we've heard this in the beginning presentations, the importance of what we're doing. But I'll just capture this by saying one quote that really brings it home to me from the World Economic Forum: that today business as usual is making our planet unlivable. And for me, this is summed up by the painting that you see in front of you, the angry fish. And there's a bit of a story that goes with this, so I want to share it with you. My daughter and I recently bought this painting. We bought it at a market, and we bought it as a reminder of mankind's impact on the oceans and the planet. And we call it the angry fish. It's about 1 meter square, and the fish covers most of the canvas. It looks angry, right? It's angry because it's painted on plastic rubbish. Yeah, the artist collects plastic bags washed up on beaches from around the world, probably even Malaysia, and incorporates them into his paintings. Remember that the WWF forecasts, for instance, that oceans will have more plastic waste than fish by 2050. And we know that the health of the ocean is intimately tied to our health, with billions of people depending on marine and coastal biodiversity for their livelihoods. These coastal waters are deteriorating due to pollution and eutrophication. Without concerted efforts, this coastal eutrophication is expected to increase in 20% of large marine ecosystems. We know that 4.2 billion people lack safely managed sanitation and 3 billion people lack basic hand washing facilities at home. I mean, these are just a few facts about SDG 6, clean water and sanitation, and SDG 14, life below water. Now, companies play a major role in transitioning the global economy to be more sustainable, to be more equitable, and to be more SDG aligned. What we're talking about on this webinar benefits everyone's future. And when I think about it, I look at it through this lens. You know, the artist is doing his part to change the world through his art. So I'm always asking myself, what more can I do? What part can I play? And hopefully after today's session, you have some of the answers as to how you can contribute. You heard a very good introduction of myself. I'm representing S&P Global today, and I wanted just to share with you the work that we do across the global economy. And we really work in all parts of financial systems. So I think Isabel's presentation summed up very well the need for a focus on biodiversity and natural capital. We're working with companies, investors, banks, and the financial institutions, regulators, exchanges to help bring this to the marketplace. I'm representing solutions across indices, data and analytics, ratings, and Platts, who are doing the benchmarking, for instance, on carbon pricing. To start with, I want to focus your attention on the growing emphasis on biodiversity. And this is the recognition that nature plays and contributes enormously to creating economic value. Recently, we've seen the numbers as large as $44 trillion of economic value generated by biodiversity. And this is globally. Unfortunately, through human behavior and through the activities of corporates, where up until recently we've been treating this without any regard. And we can calculate that since 1970 we've lost half of the forests and coral reefs globally, 80% of the wetlands, and that global wildlife populations have declined by an average 60%. As Isabel highlighted, this biodiversity is an important part in creating the value that companies generate. The question is, how do we measure this? We looked at it through an analysis of calculating the dollar value of the natural capital costs of companies. And here's an example of some work that we did with Green Biz. We created the State of Green Business 2020 report. And in that report, we calculated the natural capital costs of the largest 1,200 global companies and identify that exceeds $5 trillion US. What's surprising is these natural capital costs exceed the net income of these companies by 1.5 times. You could say that all these companies are trading at a loss when you take into account their natural capital impacts. What are those natural capital impacts that we're assessing? We're looking at the impacts from the emissions of the organization, whether those are carbon emissions or whether they're emissions through its use of fossil fuels. We're looking at ways that organization counters those emissions through their production and use of alternative energy sources and renewable energy. We're digging deep into how that organization relies on water sources, and whether they take that into account. Are they including targets on their water consumption within the goals of the organization? And are those goals being measured throughout the organization to the board level as part of the governance of the organization and through the remuneration measures of the C-suite? If I dig deeper into the ways that the natural capital costs of a company can be analysed, you can see here from an investor perspective, looking at and analysing the constituents within the portfolio of that investor and calculating for each company that they own in their portfolio, their costs of that company throughout their value chain on air pollution, greenhouse gases, land and water pollution, natural resource use, waste, and water use. By aggregating up the constituent weights in the portfolio of each of those companies, we can give an indication to investors of the impact of their investments on the natural capital costs. And here you can see, for instance, that greenhouse gases and water make up a large portion of the costs, in this case in millions of British pounds. We can break those costs down into where they come from within each of the organizations in the investor's portfolio. And here you see in dark green those natural capital costs coming directly from the organization. If you like, a scope 1 emissions or air pollution or water pollutants of that organization, what's generated and used within the operations of that company. We can also look beyond the company to their suppliers, and we can be more specific about where in the supply chain we're analyzing that company's natural capital costs. We can look at the suppliers that the corporate chooses within its own operations. So the first tier of suppliers, for instance, if you're an automotive company, we can identify the supply chain natural capital costs of the companies that are used to acquire the doors, the wheels, the windows, the mirrors, the seats of that organization. And we capture all those in a category we call first tier indirect. We also look at further down the supply chain at the remaining organizations that are supplying the suppliers all the way through to the raw materials. An example of this analysis for one company is Puma, and I chose Puma out of the many companies that we look at because it was one of the first companies that we analysed through the organisation that started 20 years ago, TrueCost, which was one of the leading foundations to assess climate risks and natural capital costs. So this natural capital cost assessment has been thought about for a long time. And Puma were one of the first companies to come to us and want to understand their broader impact on nature. What you can see immediately is that we can aggregate up the total costs in terms of environmental profit and loss to indicate an impact of £145 million. And I can identify where that comes through in the supply chain to be specific that a large part of their natural capital costs come through that supply chain, 94%. And over half of that, 57%, of the environmental impacts are associated with the production of raw materials. Very consistent with the analysis that we saw in the example of Kering. And also pointing to your organisations and Malaysian organisations that are in similar business lines or likely have similar natural capital costs through their supply chain. We also notice that GHG emissions make up 90% of that total impact coming from the offices, stores and warehouses. Another way to think about natural capital costs are the impacts of climate change. And I've given one example here of the physical risks as a result of global warming and the changing climate leading to a change in the intensity and frequency of climate hazards. And here's an example of heat waves at 2050 in an extreme heat wave scenario. And across the equator, you can see here the dark red, the extreme high heat wave impact, and how this will affect the populations, the social capital, the capital from the labour force, the natural capital, as we see the changing weather patterns or long-term trends from climate change impacting where organisations can operate and how much access they have to those natural capital resources, such as water. And so by being able to measure the water required within an organisation gives us the ability then to understand today's natural capital costs and the risk in the future as climate change impacts change the environment in which a company operates in its location of operation, how that will impact an organisation. This can be done at the asset level for individual companies. Another way to think about natural capital is balancing the positives and the negatives. And here's an example of a total value analysis overview that we provide for a company. And we're looking at this through the lens of environmental, social, financial aspects, and then the total across the organization. We have done similar assessments for entities across Asia, as well as in the US and Europe. And here's some of the measures that we look at from a total business value across financial metrics, environmental metrics, and social metrics. For example, looking at the environmental metrics, we have the positive impact of biodiversity conservation balanced by those negative impacts from greenhouse gas emissions, land use, air and water pollutants, and water consumption, some of the examples. Last but not least, in my presentation, we can take all that information and we can calculate and aggregate it to identify for a company the positive and negative impacts from total value at a product level. So here's an example for an organization where they have a positive social contribution when balancing the positive and the negative impacts of $8 created per kilogram of product. And environmental, similarly, a positive impact of $2 per kilogram of product. And you can see here on the chart on the right hand side that the balance between the negative and impacts and the benefits for both environmental and social. This information can be used by the organization to understand better its operations and bring these into its overall financial assessment. And this is being looked at through not just investors, as the example I showed you, but throughout the value chain by the customers of companies who are concerned about their supply chain impacts. And as we saw, supply chain makes up a large part of that natural capital cost. I'll leave it there and look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. We will now start our Q&A session, and I will hand you over to our moderator for the session, Zalina Shamsuddin, who many of you already know. She's the General Manager for Capital Markets Malaysia, which is an affiliate of the Securities Commission Malaysia, mandated with promoting Malaysia's capital market, both domestically and internationally. She has over 20 years of experience, predominantly in corporate advisory, over 5 countries across Asia and the Middle East. Over to you, Zalina.
Thanks a lot, Zara. Thank you, Michael and Isabel. I'm going to sort of start off with a few questions because I think we have 15 minutes left before the end of the session. Isabel, I'll lobby the first one to you so that Michael can catch his breath for a minute. So, you know, both of you have mentioned that you've worked with a lot of organizations, some of them in Malaysia or some of them in the region. What's been some of your, were there instances, could you just share your experiences? Were there instances where the management were caught off guard when they did a natural capital assessment?
Yeah, so we see this all the time where people are doing an assessment, they're not really aware of what their dependencies are, particularly when it comes to dependencies. There's always a little bit of surprise. But yeah, one story that I really like, coming back to the Kering example, that one surprising thing they found out of doing their natural capital work was, globally, there's been a huge rise in demand for cashmere. And that means that these Mongolian herders were increasing the size of their herds from 500 goats to over 1,000. And this is a region that supplies 90% of the world's cashmere. So the overgrazing from this increase in goats was really affecting local ecosystems. So it was degrading the land, lots more erosion. They were eating not only plants, but also roots. And this was a real risk to Kering because their supply chain was for raw material was really under threat. And then they were worried that their cashmere would be more expensive or lower quality, which is really important for a luxury brand's goods brand. So part of the problem that these goats were causing was this huge dust cloud and these dust storms that were happening in Mongolia. And they actually managed to trace the dust clouds all the way in Beijing. And it was directly related to the air quality in Beijing as a result of these herds getting bigger. So doing the natural capital assessment really led them to understand the global significance, and not say that it was directly attributed to Kering because there are lots of other goat herders that operate in the region, but understanding what was at play based on their dependency on this cashmere was really interesting for them and led them to start working with local herders to promote sustainable practices. They may get preferential rates if they've got a sustainable practice. And also it means that Kering can promote their cashmere, sustainable cashmere. So there's advantages on both sides. But yeah, I would say that sticks out as an example where the real magnitude of the effects of this cashmere was something that they hadn't really realized and that came from looking at their whole value chain.
Okay, thanks, Isabel. Michael?
Yeah, so I think about it in two ways, actually. I'm thinking about it from both, the shock perspective, as well as the negative shock and the positive surprise. And from the negative shock perspective, Puma is the one that sticks in my mind as the organisation that was most surprised when they looked at their impact. Maybe because it was one of the first that we were involved in. And so, the concepts of where those exposures are and the large exposure in the supply chain, became something that that was news to them. And mind you, I think Puma is an example of a company that while they were surprised, they were very quick to react and be responsible. And continue to evolve their thinking in their impact. And then I think about a positive example where we did a net benefits report for an organisation. So similar to this total benefits report, understanding what the pros and cons are of a product. And the product we were looking at was alternative protein. So I'm not sure if people are familiar with the concept of alternative protein, but in other words, it's a way to replace the meat that is being consumed, and it's an important aspect of being able to continue to feed a growing population. Given that the protein that comes from cattle, for instance, as an example, consumes enormous amounts of resources. And so we did this analysis for a company assessing the for the net benefits of this alternative protein burger. And the benefits were enormous, within the magnitude of hundreds of times better in terms of some of the metrics around water consumption, eutrophication, GHG emissions, for example. So they were then able to take that and be more confident about their investment, which they were looking at from a financial window only at first. But of course, the motivation now is very much around, well, this is good from an environmental perspective and a social perspective.
Okay, thanks, Michael. So my next question is to both of you. I think if you essentially right, if you're looking at the private sector and corporates, they're struggling, and they're at different stages of the journey in climate change, understanding it, disclosing it, understanding what their whole value chain has an impact. And so, there are those who are still grappling with GHG emissions and trying to figure out how their supply chain is looking at that and how to mitigate their GHG emissions. And now we're talking about natural capital, which in some ways seems quite advanced, but I think the companies that are already far into this journey and are already disclosing not only narrative from a narrative point of view, but they're also disclosing performance. Do you think, what, in your experience, what sort of triggered management or owners to start looking at natural capital? Is it a natural evolution that everyone should start looking at that when they're looking at TCFD, or what's the trigger point? Isabel?
Yeah, maybe I'll just say from our perspective, it's because it makes sense. It's logical. The second you understand this thing about dependencies on natural capital, then it makes total sense in terms of the longevity of your business to be measuring and valuing these elements. So once the awareness and the company has got far enough along its journey to understand that, then it snowballs from there. I would say that, of course, there are lots of organizations that are already doing this, but then it's also a very early field for many organizations, and it can be very daunting to take up this task of starting to measure and value these natural capital elements. And I'll just mention a couple of resources that we have for companies like this. The website that I posted explains a lot about what the concepts are and how they can be applicable to you. We have a case study database, which has over 200 examples of different businesses and governments and financial institutions that have done this work before, and that can be a huge inspiration as well. The We Value Nature campaign, which was organised by the Capitals Coalition but funded by the EU, a very broad campaign, has created training material, so entry-level training material for companies that have never heard of natural capital, that can go through the processes of learning what it's about and to start applying it with their business. And all of this is open access, open source training material. We run a lot of that through the coalition. We also have a community hub, which is a website where people can go to seek support from other practitioners and to access all of these resources. And of course, there are lots of tools that are being developed by different organizations, and they're all assembled on one website that I will post here. But there is a lot of support out there for companies who are interested in starting on this journey. And really the first thing is to just start doing it and to take the leap. Michael?
Yeah, thanks, Selena. I totally agree that there's I think we're at a point where this is a change in how finance is viewed. We're at a turning point in the history of finance, is the way I say it. And corporates, the way they behave, that corporates become responsible entities. And if we go back, I mean, I always think back to like the 1970s and the focus on profit at all costs. We've come a long way since then, and the expectations of consumers has changed. And we realize that by companies behaving in a more responsible way, we create greater wealth for everybody. And that's true in the climate change space. It's represented by initiatives like TCFD, which are now well supported and increasingly supported. It's represented by many organizations that are helping companies understand their exposures. We're speaking to and working with some of the largest companies in Malaysia, palm oil companies, and they understand the impact of their organization on nature, and they understand the requirement to, or they understand the contribution of biodiversity to their organization's wealth. They have teams of people addressing sustainability issues. So this is happening. Well, it might seem hard if you're approaching it for the first time. Everything's hard for the first time, but find the resources and speak to people who are doing it, and you'll find out it's easy. There are multiple ways to start this journey. And one of the angles that I wanted to mention was it's an important part of an ESG score. So while we've talked a lot about natural capital, biodiversity, we've talked a little bit about climate change. One of the focuses of the finance community at the moment is the overall ESG profile of a company. And this is what we've talked about today, is being captured in that through an assessment of biodiversity, through an understanding of the organization's water-related risks. How do they approach that? What the business impacts of water-related incidents are to the organization. As an example, what water-related regulatory changes are impacting the pricing structures. What's their exposure to water-stressed areas? These are some of the questions that are part of the corporate sustainability assessment, which is, at its best, a survey that companies participate in. And for those companies that are in S&P Global indices, the BMI, which is a 13,000 company strong index, the CSA participation is at no charge, except for the time of the company, and we'll help them. We hold their hand through that process, especially the first time they do it. And that CSA informs the ESG score, and the ESG scores are being increasingly used by investors to make or to better inform their decisions. And parts of that are being used by the finance community to assess the sustainability, whether it's a green aspect or a social aspect, through green bonds, social bonds. In other words, better sustainability, better management of your natural capital costs will potentially open doors to new finance, and that finance at more favorable rates for companies.
Okay, thank you, Michael. We have a few questions from the floor. So I'm just going to read them out, and then if anyone can answer it, please go ahead. First question is, does environmental impact include volcanoes and earthquakes? Michael?
So our assessments would not take into account the volcanoes and earthquakes as an event. For instance, so when we're looking at physical risks, we're looking at 7 physical risks, which include heat waves, cold waves, hurricanes. So we're looking at how hurricanes affect physical assets. We're looking at wildfires, and we're looking at sea level rise, for instance. We're not capturing earthquakes or volcanoes. The consequences of those we've seen can be substantial. For instance, we don't have to look far in Asia Pacific to our country peers to see the consequences of an underwater volcano causing tidal waves. And the same with the ESG ratings. The ESG ratings are looking more at the operational and supply chain impacts, and the same physical risk analysis.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Isabel, there's a question here about the management of natural capital. I'm not sure whether you would be able to handle this, but let me just ask anyway. What approach shall a business take to initiate the process of assessing its natural capital? Should it be from the management of material sustainability matters or risk management?
I'll give it a go, and maybe
Okay.
Michael can supplement. I would say that what approach businesses should take is what I was talking about earlier. Just start reading, start understanding, and just reach out to specialists to ask for assistance. There's a lot of it out there. So that would be my take on that. Just get going with it. And in terms of material sustainability matters or risk management, I would say that they're pretty much the same thing. As part of a capitals assessment, you would start by carrying out a materiality assessment, which would tell you which elements you should be looking at in relation to your business. And then that is automatically going to link to risk, because a lot of this conversation is about how much risk are you taking on by not considering your relationship with the capitals. So I would put them in the same block, and I'd say it's both.
Okay, thank you. We're running out of time. There's one question left, and I think Zara would like to take that. No, Zara says, let's answer this question live, sorry. Michael, I think this is a perfect question for you. TEE guidelines, do they specify the links with ESG scores?
I think that would be for me, because we're the authors of the team. So yes, but basically what the team guidelines are a way of gathering this sort of information. So they're a framework where you can collect all the information on natural, social and human capital, and that can in turn inform your ESG scores. So certainly there's a direct link. You can use the framework in order to inform your ESG. So yes.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much. I'm afraid we've come to the end of the 1 hour. It went by very quickly. Thank you, Michael and Isabel. I really appreciate your time. And I've learned a lot about natural capital. I'm going to start researching a bit more in that space. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank WWF for supporting CMM with this initiative. As most of you know, CMM tries to run as many capacity development and awareness programs around climate finance and around climate change. And thank you for joining us. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Zelina, Isabel, and Michael. I hope the session was beneficial for our participants. So we're just concluding our session for today. And on behalf of CMM, WWF Malaysia, the British High Commission in Kuala Lumpur, and the British Malaysian Chamber of Commerce, a sincere thank you to all of our speakers and participants for joining us today. We hope to see you in our future sessions on natural capital throughout 2022. Have a good evening.